Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to discuss something that's truly bizarre. A discovery that challenges our basic assumptions about locations on planet Earth where complex life, including animal life, can actually survive. And that's because in this study, researchers managed to find an incredible ecosystem containing a lot of different types of life in an extremely unusual place that has not been touched by anything and basically stayed isolated for at least 11,000 years. With this particular discovery coming from somewhere deep within the planet, technically being one of those discoveries that eventually is going to rewrite biology books. And simply because when we normally think of deep underground environments, hundreds of meters or even kilometers below our feet, we don't really expect to find this kind of life. And well, if you've taken any biology class, you probably know that it's possible to find bacteria and possibly archaea, some which has been discovered to survive inside underground sediments for an extremely long time, sometimes even millions of years. But these are single-cell organisms that are known to be extreme survivors, and so technically it's no longer surprising. But for decades, biologists assumed that when it comes to more complex life and more complex cells, especially eukaryotic cells that we are made out of, these locations just did not possess enough resources. Either because of lack of oxygen or extreme energy limitations, surviving here would be impossible for anything else. Yet in this fascinating new study published in the ISME journal, a team of researchers led by ecologist Quinn Moon from University of Michigan definitively discovered a thriving, diverse, and extremely complex eukaryotic ecosystem that seems to reside inside an ancient shale deposit deep beneath Midwestern United States. And in this case, they discovered anything from rock-eating fungi, or basically tiny mushrooms that seem to thrive on rocks, to somewhat active miniature worms, and of course our favorite tardigrades. All of them thriving inside water that has not seen the light of day for over 11,000 years, since the last glaciation period. And so let's take a look at the study in more detail and discuss why this is so strange. And let's start all of this by looking at the geology first, or basically where exactly this was discovered and why it was only found now. And while all of this was discovered inside what's known as the Antrim Shale, a massive organic-rich deposit of ancient mud that formed during the late Devonian period, approximately 350 million years ago. A location that's now technically enriched in a lot of different natural gas. But back then this was a kind of a shallow sea containing a lot of different types of plankton and a lot of different algae. But over millions and millions of years, all of this organic matter eventually settled on the bottom, got buried underneath, and because of immense pressure, converted this into something that a lot of different companies now want to extract. Natural gas, or basically methane. As a matter of fact, this is one of the largest natural gas fields in the United States, producing billions and billions of cubic feet of biogenic methane. And it's the word biogenic that's sort of the key here. It means that this particular natural gas isn't just created by the geological heat, but it's actually being generated by living microbes breaking down the organic matter inside this rock. And so the scientists behind the study teamed up with the local energy company, the company that pumps massive amounts of water into these wells, to basically collect some of this water directly from them in the wells of Antrim County in Michigan. This was coming from the depth of about 250 to 556 meters below the surface, or over 1,800 feet deep. And these wells have been pumping this water pretty much every single day for at least 10 years, meaning that the water they analyzed was genuinely coming from deep within the shale and not just sitting in the pipes or coming from somewhere shallow. And well, it's of course the discovery from this water that was kind of surprising. And that's because when they analyzed the biomass in this water, they discovered that at least 20% of everything inside of it was not bacteria, but actually complex cells, including something that resembled mushrooms. And once again, this is really important because, well, let's briefly discuss the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. This is something that you might have learned in high school biology, but basically prokaryotes, like bacteria, are tiny, simple, and do not contain any organelles. In contrast, eukaryotes, including fungi, plants, and animals, have complex internal structures and do require a lot of things to support the cell. And so because eukaryotes are much larger and much more complex, they normally require way more energy and very specific conditions to survive. And so in this case, when scientists were measuring all of this, they basically assumed that all of the biomass collected and all of the DNA would basically be coming from either bacteria or archaea. Once again, because the eukaryotes are believed to be too fragile to survive in these extreme conditions underground. But in this case, Queen Moon's team did something very precise and actually used two parallel methods. First, they filtered the water and looked at the cells under special epifluorescence microscopes, but then they also used the PCR method in order to count all of the DNA fragments and find out what they're coming from. And well, it turns out that in every millimeter of water they pumped, they found anywhere from 40 to 70,000 microbial cells and at least 4,000 to 7,000 fungal cells. And because fungal cells are much larger and much more massive, they represented approximately 20% of mass. And so here, if you do the math, it means that for every single drop of this deep groundwater, there seem to be at least 250 fungal cells inside of it, and several thousand bacteria as well. And what's even more interesting is that this ratio and this overall balance seems to be remarkably similar to what we usually find in a lot of other water environments, including the open ocean and frozen soils in Antarctica, implying that even in this extreme environment, complex life seems to be a major player and seems to play some kind of a role in this ecosystem that we obviously still don't understand. And now let's, discuss the most interesting part. So what were those organisms and why was it so shocking to find them in this environment? And of course, how are they actually surviving there? Well, this is mostly based on a DNA analysis, but right now they identified 690 species of fungi from 6 different phyla and even managed to grow 200 of them in the lab, or basically they took some of the samples and then made them grow inside the petri dish. And while out of these 205 species, 13 of them were completely new to science. We've never seen these before. And once again, we're not talking about bacteria, we are talking about basically mushrooms. And it turns out that 2 of them were the dominant class, something referred to as agaricomycetes and dothidiomycetes, 2 different classes of fungi that we actually know quite a lot about. Now, the first class, the agaricomycetes, is actually something that we're all familiar with. It's the class of fungi that produce an actual physical mushroom on the surface. So basically, when you think of a mushroom, that's an agaricomycete. Although in this case, deep underwater, they're most likely not actually growing these caps and stems because they live inside these very tight, rocky pores. So something resembling this. Although for all we know, maybe they do. We obviously don't really know yet. And while normally here on the surface, these types of fungi are famous for their ability to consume decaying wood. Or essentially in the forest, they're usually the mushrooms growing on various dead tree trunks, helping digest them and basically helping the forest recycle the materials. And in the forest, they're very important because normally wood contains something referred to as lignins and cellulose, which are incredibly tough and very difficult to digest, with bacteria basically unable to do so. But over millions of years, fungi evolved to break this apart through a secretion of a very powerful and very acidic enzyme that essentially helps them digest pretty much everything in the forest. Okay, well, I guess the question is, so what exactly were they doing down there deep in the water? Well, we know that this ancient shale is packed with a lot of fossilized organic matter, including ancient algae and a lot of ancient woody leftovers, millions and millions years old. And so it's quite likely that these fungi contain some kind of a digestive tool that helps them consume all of this carbon, essentially eating this ancient rock. So basically they dissolve these very tough molecules, turning them into much simpler dissolved organics that life around them, including various bacteria, can then consume. With the second class, known as dothidiomycetes, very likely doing something similar, but exactly what, we obviously still don't know. Although we know that they do tend to form symbiotic relations with a lot of different other species, so it's quite possible that that's what they're doing here as well. But discovering fungi is one thing, discovering more complex animals, that's a completely different mystery. Because in this case, alongside these fungi, the team also found genetic signatures of rotifers that we usually find inside freshwater ponds, different types of segmented worms and roundworms, and like I mentioned, the famous tardigrades, also known as water bears, known for the ability to survive extreme conditions. Although in this case, even for them, this is maybe just a little bit too extreme. But intriguingly, in this case, we know that this is an active ecosystem because here they even found parasites, specifically intracellular parasites, with the genetic traces of something known as Rosella mysota and Ichthyosporea, definitely confirming that whatever is living here is also being preyed upon by different parasites, with one of these parasites being a fungus as well, a fungus that actually parasitizes other fungi. But the second parasite is actually really surprising because we know that it tends to parasitize animals, and normally fish. And though obviously it's possible that it's basically parasitizing worms and tardigrades, right now this also implies that there could be more complex animals living underneath. And so just to summarize and I guess help you visualize this, just imagine how bizarre this whole thing is. Hundreds of meters beneath the surface, in a somewhat nondescript location in Michigan, there is a complete multi-tiered food web dominated by different fungi and containing actual animals thriving in this ancient ecosystem that has not been touched for 11,000 years. With these fungi feeding off the ancient carbon trapped inside these rocks, bacteria feeding on all of the byproducts, and more complex animals including worms and tardigrades grazing on everything else. And we even have parasites playing their role in the ecosystem as well, with the tardigrades potentially representing a kind of an apex predator, making this a very strange microscopic safari park. With the last obvious question being, so how did they get there anyway? And to find out, scientists looked at the chemistry of the water itself and basically analyzed the stable isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen to trace exactly where the water came from. And here they discovered that this fresh, brackish water seems to have a very specific isotope signature that matches late Pleistocene subglacial meltwater. Or just to rephrase this, approximately 11,000 to 20,000 years ago, massive continental ice sheets that covered this part of North America during the last glaciation period started to melt as the climate warmed up, and the immense pressure of the overlying ice seems to have formed these natural fractures in the bedrock, with a lot of the water forcing its way hundreds of meters into the shale and basically bringing all of the life with it that got stuck there ever since. Which means that this particular ecosystem, or this community, has been enjoying remarkably stable geochemical conditions, completely isolated from the surface for the past 11,000 years, possibly longer. And let that sink in for a second. It means that the ancestors of these tardigrades were swept underground when woolly mammoths still roamed above the surface, and ancient humans were still hunter-gatherers, running away from various wildlife. And so over the millennia underground, these organisms adapted to these pitch-black conditions, somehow surviving in this highly pressurized, low-oxygen world, developing in a very different way from their surface cousins. Although in this case, actual tardigrades and actual worms have not been captured yet, only their genes. But for evolutionary biology and for studies of possible extraterrestrial life, this is actually a brilliant discovery. Mostly because this is a natural laboratory right here on Earth that can actually show us how a lot of organisms can survive in extreme conditions as long as there is some water and some carbon, while at the same time presenting us with a slightly different view of the so-called carbon cycle. And while technically 90% of all organic carbon on Earth is stored in these deep subsurface environments. But if this paper is correct, this carbon is not static and is not just trapped inside rock because it seems to be actively absorbed by a lot of different hungry fungi. And so by digesting all of this, these fungi produce a lot of organic acids, ethanols, and carbon dioxides, which can then feed a lot of different methanogenic archaea, converting them into methane gas. And so if Earth contains a lot of these deep subsurface ecosystems like this one, it means that the buried carbon can be converted into methane and carbon dioxide much faster than we previously thought. But also obviously producing way more methane than we imagined, which is potentially stored in a lot of different locations on the planet. And so definitely quite an exciting discovery, especially because now we can pretty certainly state that many different locations in the solar system and beyond possibly contain something similar. So assuming that life evolved anywhere else, it means that we can now expect life to exist in locations similar to this, because it turns out that when it comes to subsurface life, even complex animals do not require sunlight and do not even need fresh surface organic inputs in order to thrive. They seem to be able to survive for thousands of years in complete isolation. with this brilliant paper essentially reminding us how little we still know about what's literally under our feet, with the entire biosphere existing down there and only now being mapped. Anyway, you can find the study in the description below, but once we discover something else, I'll come back and follow this up with the next part. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying a Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.